Tonight, we open the gates to an empire built on power, faith, and fear. The Ottoman Empire. Behind the shimmering domes of Istanbul and the golden halls of Topkapi Palace, there lived men who ruled the world, yet were prisoners of their own traditions. These were the sultans, powerful beyond measure, yet bound by rituals that often turned their palaces into cages. Their secrets were whispered in hidden chambers, carved into forbidden rooms, and locked away in the shadows of history. Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet, we will walk through those chambers together, uncovering the dark truths that shaped the lives of the Ottoman Sultans. Truths more unsettling than any battlefield. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing before the towering gates of Topkapi Palace. The marble glistens in the sunlight. Guards stand with silent discipline, and beyond the doors lies a world both breathtaking and terrifying. This is not just a palace. It is a living machine of power, a labyrinth built not only with stone and tile, but with secrets, rules, and silent fears. To step inside is to step into the very heart of the Ottoman Empire, where the sultans lived, ruled, and dreamed, yet also where they faced their darkest truths. The palace was more than a home. It was a carefully crafted symbol of authority. Every wall, every fountain, every courtyard was designed to remind visitors of the sultan's power. Yet to those who lived within, the walls often felt less like protection and more like barriers. Outsiders imagined luxury, silk cushions, glittering chandeliers, and endless feasts. But to the men and women who spent their lives behind these walls, it was a gilded prison, one where the rules of survival were written not in law books, but in whispers. Inside these walls, power was absolute, yet fragile. The sultans who ruled from here controlled lands stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary. Their word could command armies, shift economies, and decide the fates of nations. And yet, within their own palace, their lives were controlled by a different kind of power, tradition, ritual, and the unseen hands of those around them. To be a sultan was to sit at the very top of the world, but also to be trapped in a web where one wrong move could end in betrayal. The harem, often imagined as a place of indulgence, was in truth a world of strict discipline and silent rivalry. Hundreds of women, brought from across empires and kingdoms, lived behind locked doors. To survive, they needed more than beauty. They needed cunning. Every glance, every word, every friendship could decide whether a woman rose to power as the sultan's favorite or disappeared into obscurity. For the women, the palace was both a home and a battlefield. Their weapons were not swords, but charm, intelligence, and influence. And behind their smiles lay calculations sharper than any blade. But it was not only the women who lived under such pressures. The young princes, the heirs to the empire, were raised in an environment thick with suspicion. Brothers grew up side by side, playing in the gardens, learning the Quran, studying calligraphy and the art of war. Yet each knew that one day their bond of brotherhood would be tested. The cruel reality of the Ottoman throne was that only one could truly rule, and history tells us of countless princes who found their lives cut short, not on the battlefield, but inside the palace walls, victims of a system designed to prevent civil war, yet one that turned brother against brother. The Sultan himself, though draped in silks and surrounded by servants, was no stranger to fear. He was watched constantly by guards, by advisors, by the women of the harem, and even by his own family. He could never walk truly alone, never speak entirely freely. Every word carried weight, and every decision was followed by ripples of consequence. To sit on the Ottoman throne was to hold immense power, but it also meant carrying a burden that few could truly endure. Many sultans spent their nights sleepless, wandering gardens or gazing silently at the Bosphorus, trapped by their own thoughts. One of the darkest truths of this empire was how power was maintained, not always through armies or politics, but through silence and secrecy. In the shadows of the palace, eunuchs moved quietly, keeping the harem under control, delivering messages, and ensuring that no scandal escaped the walls. These men, often taken as boys and reshaped into servants, lived their lives in loyalty to the palace. They held keys to doors that others never saw, and in their silence, they carried stories that the world was never meant to hear. Some of them wielded incredible influence, deciding who could see the Sultan, who could deliver messages, and even who might live or die within the walls of Topkapi. Outside the palace gates, the empire glittered. Mosques with soaring minarets pierced the sky, markets overflowed with spices and silk, and scholars debated in courtyards filled with fountains. To the common people, the Sultan was almost a shadow of God on earth, a ruler chosen to maintain order and justice. But inside the palace, the man behind the title was often far more complicated, sometimes wise, sometimes cruel, often lonely, and always watched. The contrast between the Sultan as a public figure and the Sultan as a private man reveals a truth more disturbing than any legend, that absolute power does not always bring freedom, and that those who seem most powerful are often the most trapped. And so, as the night deepens and you rest, imagine yourself walking through those silent halls. The tiled walls gleam in the moonlight, the gardens echo with distant footsteps, and the air feels heavy with unspoken stories. Somewhere behind a door, a woman whispers her fears to a trusted friend. Somewhere else, a prince stares out of a window, wondering if tomorrow will be his last. And in the deepest chamber, the Sultan himself sits in silence, surrounded by riches, yet haunted by the shadows of his own palace. This was the Ottoman world at its core, a place where beauty hid cruelty, where tradition concealed fear, and where every smile could hide a dagger. These are the dark truths of the Ottoman Sultans, truths whispered not in history books, but in the shadows of Topkapi Palace. Imagine a young boy running through the gardens of the palace. He is dressed in fine silks, his laughter echoing between the marble walls, and behind him walks a tutor carrying scrolls of scripture. This boy is no ordinary child. He is a prince of the Ottoman Empire, a Shahzad, born into a life of unimaginable privilege and crushing destiny. From the very moment of his birth, he is marked not just as a future leader, but also as a potential threat. For in the Ottoman world, to be born as a prince was to step into a dangerous game, a game where childhood was brief, innocence was fragile, and survival often meant outliving your own brothers. The system that shaped these young princes was as unique as it was brutal. Unlike in many other empires, where a single heir was chosen and trained for rule, the Ottomans believed that any son of the Sultan could claim the throne. On the surface, it sounded fair, each prince a possible ruler, but in practice it meant that every brother was a rival, and every bond of family carried the weight of suspicion. The empire could not afford divided rule. To prevent civil war, the Ottomans developed a system that turned succession into a matter of life and death. Princes grew up surrounded by luxury, but also by lessons in obedience, religion, military arts, and politics. Tutors drilled them in the recitation of the Quran, the writing of poetry, the strategies of warfare, and the art of statecraft. They were reminded again and again that their destiny was to rule or to perish. Some embraced this with discipline, while others grew fearful, even resentful. Childhood games in the gardens were often tinged with shadows, as brothers knew that one day those same playmates might become executioners or victims. One of the darkest practices of the empire was the law of fratricide. When a new sultan rose to power, it was considered not only his right but his duty to eliminate his brothers, ensuring that no rival could challenge him. It was a law born from chaos, intended to keep the empire strong by preventing internal wars. And yet, for the young princes, it meant that their very lives were conditional. The moment their brother claimed the throne, their fates were sealed. Some were strangled with silk cords, others quietly removed in the dead of night. The silk cord itself was symbolic. Royal blood was not to be spilled, so the method of execution was designed to be honorable, even as it tore families apart. There are stories of mothers who wept as their sons were taken, powerless to intervene. The harem, often imagined as a place of protection, became instead a theater of grief and fear. A mother might raise her child with love, hoping he would be the one to survive, but she knew deep inside that the very system of succession demanded sacrifice. Survival depended not on love, but on luck, timing, and the politics of the court. Over time, as the empire matured, this practice shifted. Instead of execution, many princes were confined to what became known as the cafes, or the cage. This was not a cage of iron bars, but a set of luxurious yet confining chambers inside the palace. Here, the Sultan's brothers were kept under constant watch, cut off from the outside world, sometimes for decades. They lived in rooms filled with cushions, books, and servants, but their world shrank to the size of their gilded prison. Some grew restless, pacing endlessly through their chambers. Others sank into melancholy, their minds unraveling under the weight of isolation. The cage was meant to prevent rebellion, but it also created rulers who were unprepared for the realities of power. A prince who spent half his life locked away, deprived of experience, could suddenly be thrust onto the throne when his brother died. Some emerged weak, indecisive, or even unstable. The empire, in trying to protect itself, had created a system where its leaders were often broken before they even began to rule. And yet, the cage itself became one of the empire's most haunting symbols. Within those walls, countless stories of lost youth unfolded. Imagine a prince sitting by a latticed window, staring at the gardens he could not enter. He hears the laughter of children outside, the music of festivals, the calls of merchants in the distance. But for him, life is reduced to silence. His only companions are the guards who watch him, the books he reads, and the thoughts that slowly consume him. Some princes turn to poetry, filling pages with verses of longing and despair. Others turned inward, losing themselves in prayer, their minds wandering to a world beyond the palace walls. The tragedy of the cage was not only in the suffering of the princes, but in the shadow it cast over the throne itself. When a sultan emerged from such confinement, he often carried the scars of isolation, paranoia, indecision, or cruelty. The empire demanded strength, but it had built a system that produced rulers who were fragile, haunted by fears, and sometimes unfit for the immense responsibility they inherited. And still, the people outside the palace gates never saw this suffering. To them, the Sultan appeared in magnificent processions, surrounded by soldiers and banners, his presence awe-inspiring. They saw only the surface, the wealth, the authority, the divine aura of kingship. They could not imagine that behind those walls, their ruler might be a man who had spent half his life in silence, broken by the very system that was meant to protect the empire. As you drift deeper into the night, picture those forgotten princes. Picture their footsteps echoing in empty corridors, their voices soft as they recited verses into the stillness, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their fate was not in their own hands. These were the lives sacrificed to the throne, not on battlefields, but in hidden chambers behind locked doors. It is in these stories that we glimpse one of the darkest truths of the Ottoman Empire, that power, in its most absolute form, demands not only victories and conquests, but the quiet suffering of those who are silenced before they can even begin to live. And so, the cage became not just a place, but a symbol of what it meant to rule, or to wait forever in the shadows of power. This is the fate that shaped the sultans, and it is here that the empire's story grows both majestic and tragic, a reminder that even within the greatest palaces, freedom can be a distant dream. Step deeper into the palace, past the outer courtyards where soldiers train and scribes carry scrolls. Ahead lies a door guarded not just by men with spears, but by silence itself. Beyond this threshold is the harem, the most mysterious and misunderstood part of the Ottoman world. To outsiders, it was a place of beauty, lavish rooms filled with women in silks, the air perfumed with incense, the sound of music drifting through arched hallways. But within its walls, reality was far more complicated. This was not a paradise of leisure. It was a theater of power, rivalry, and survival, where every smile could hide a dagger and every whisper could change the fate of the empire. The harem was the sultan's private domain, hidden from the eyes of the outside world. Here lived hundreds of women, wives, concubines, and attendants, each brought from different corners of the empire and beyond. Some were captured in wars, others were gifts from foreign rulers, and many were purchased from distant markets. For most, life in the harem began not as a choice, but as a command of destiny. They left behind families, languages, and homelands to enter a world where freedom was replaced by rules, and survival depended on the favor of the sultan and his household. To understand the harem is to understand that it was not simply a place of pleasure. It was a carefully structured hierarchy, a system where every woman had a rank, a role, and a duty. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, whose influence often extended far beyond the palace walls. She was not only a maternal figure, but also a political force, shaping decisions, advising her son, and at times ruling in his name. Beneath her were the sultan's consorts, each competing for affection and influence. Beneath them were the attendants, tutors, and younger women, all of whom played their part in the delicate balance of palace life. The rivalries within the harem were fierce, often more dangerous than any battlefield. A favored consort could rise from obscurity to immense power, her words influencing the sultan's policies, her children becoming heirs to the throne. Yet the same woman could fall in a single day, undone by a whisper, a rumor, or the jealousy of another. Alliances formed and shattered constantly. A smile exchanged in a corridor could signal trust or betrayal. Women learned quickly that survival required more than beauty. It demanded intelligence, caution, and the ability to read every subtle shift of expression. Behind the jeweled walls, plots unfolded quietly. Some women used music, poetry, and charm to win favor. Others relied on cunning, feeding the Sultan carefully chosen words, planting seeds of suspicion, or elevating their children in his eyes. The harem was filled with eyes and ears. Nothing went unnoticed, and every word spoken in confidence risked being carried elsewhere. Eunuchs, loyal only to the palace, acted as silent gatekeepers, ensuring that order was maintained and that the world beyond the harem never truly knew what happened within. The influence of the harem reached far beyond its walls. Decisions that shaped the empire, alliances, appointments, even wars, were sometimes born in these chambers. A single word from the Valid Sultan could determine the fate of a vizier. A single glance from a favored consort could sway the Sultan's mood before a council meeting. Outsiders imagined the harem as a place of indulgence, but in truth, it was one of the empire's most powerful political arenas, hidden behind layers of silence. Yet for many women, life in the harem was one of isolation and longing. Though surrounded by beauty, they were cut off from the outside world. Their lives revolved around rituals, lessons, and competition. Some found solace in religion, spending long hours in prayer. Others turned to art, creating poetry and embroidery that carried their emotions in secret patterns. Some simply endured, their dreams fading with time. The harem could make a woman powerful, but it could just as easily consume her in loneliness. There were moments of tenderness, too, friendships forged in the quiet hours of the night, laughter shared over simple meals, songs sung together in hidden courtyards. But even these bonds carried weight, for trust was always fragile. One wrong word could transform a friend into a rival, and one careless confession could bring ruin. The Valid Sultan, perhaps more than anyone else, embodied the contradictions of the harem. As the mother of the Sultan, she held immense authority, yet her own power was tied entirely to her son. If he died, her influence faded instantly, and she could find herself cast aside in favor of the next Valide. For the women of the harem, life was never secure, never permanent. It was a constant dance between hope and fear, between ambition and survival. And through it all, the Sultan himself walked a careful line. Surrounded by affection, flattery, and desire, he was at once the center of this world and its most vulnerable figure. Every woman who sought his attention sought also to shape his reign. Every smile offered to him carried an intention. Every touch, every word was part of a larger struggle for influence. To the outside world, he appeared untouchable, a ruler chosen by destiny. But within the harem, he was also a man, subject to persuasion, to passion, to loneliness, and to the subtle manipulations of those around him. As you drift further into the story, imagine walking through those tiled corridors, hearing the distant sound of music mixed with whispers. Imagine the flicker of oil lamps on the walls, the rustle of silk robes as women pass by, their eyes filled with secrets. Somewhere, a mother prays for her son's future. Somewhere else, two rivals exchange polite words, their true intentions hidden beneath practiced smiles. And in the center of it all, the Sultan sits in quiet thought, unaware, or perhaps all too aware, that his empire is being shaped not only in council chambers and battlefields, but here, in the silent power of the harem. This was the hidden heart of the Ottoman world, a place of beauty and cruelty, of ambition and despair, where lives were shaped by the silent tides of influence. To understand the empire, one must first walk these halls, for it is here that the darkest truths often took root, not in the open, but in the shadows, where only whispers dared to live. Step quietly now, for we are entering a part of the palace where voices drop to whispers, and footsteps echo strangely against the stone. Here, in the long corridors that connect the Sultan's chambers to the harem, move the figures who carried some of the empire's deepest secrets, the eunuchs. To the outside world, they were merely servants, men stripped of family and legacy, their lives devoted to service. But in truth, the eunuchs were the invisible threads that held the Ottoman palace together. They were the watchers, the messengers, the keepers of doors that no one else could open, and within their silence, they carried power far greater than most dared to imagine. The story of the eunuchs begins in childhood, taken from distant lands, Africa, the Balkans, or beyond. They were chosen not for wealth or lineage, but for the absence of both. Transformed by the harshest of practices, they were remade into figures of loyalty, their lives bound completely to the palace. To outsiders, their fate might have seemed tragic, a loss of freedom and humanity. Yet within the palace walls, their roles became both indispensable and extraordinary. For in a world where power was hidden behind veils and locked doors, the eunuchs were the only ones allowed to pass freely. There were two kinds of eunuchs in the Ottoman court, the white eunuchs and the black eunuchs. The white eunuchs, often from the Balkans, served in the outer palace. They managed the education of princes, oversaw the palace schools, and carried messages between officials. Their influence was significant, but it was the black eunuchs, many brought from Africa, who held the most mysterious power. They guarded the harem, controlled access to the Sultan's private chambers, and became the trusted intermediaries between the ruler and the hidden world of his family. At the head of the black eunuchs stood the Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch. To the outside world, he might have seemed a servant. But within the palace, his influence rivaled that of viziers and generals. He decided who entered the harem, who could speak to the Sultan, and which messages reached his ears. His position was one of extraordinary trust, for he alone moved between the most sacred spaces of the palace, the Sultan's quarters and the harem. In his silence lay both opportunity and danger, for he could elevate allies, destroy rivals, and shape the politics of the empire without ever lifting a sword. Consider the delicate balance of this power. The viziers, powerful men of state, commanded armies and managed treasuries, yet even they depended on the goodwill of eunuchs to gain access to the Sultan. Ambassadors, carrying the concerns of foreign kings, could not present their messages without first passing through the invisible gatekeepers of the palace. Even the women of the harem, with all their influence, relied on eunuchs to deliver letters, gifts, or whispers of intrigue. In this way, the eunuchs became the hidden arteries of the Ottoman state, carrying information, desires, and commands between worlds that were otherwise sealed from one another. Their loyalty was tested constantly, for in a world of shadows, temptation was never far away. Some eunuchs rose to incredible wealth and prestige, using their position to amass fortunes, patronize mosques, or build schools. Others fell victim to suspicion, accused of corruption, betrayal, or secret alliances. Theirs was a life of constant vigilance, where one mistake could mean exile, or worse. And yet for centuries, their system endured, making them some of the most enduring figures in Ottoman history. But what must life have been like for them behind the masks of duty? Imagine the chief eunuch walking alone at night through the palace corridors, his footsteps echoing softly. He knows every door, every passage, every secret meeting that has taken place. He has seen princes taken to the cage, women weeping in silence, viziers whispering promises they dare not put in writing. He carries within him stories that no historian will ever fully uncover, stories too dangerous to be told. And yet, he remains silent, for silence is his survival, and survival is his only freedom. There is a haunting truth in their role. Stripped of family, of heirs, of legacy, the eunuchs lived for the palace alone. Their identities were bound to service, their fates entwined with those of the sultans they served. Some found meaning in this, devoting themselves with unwavering loyalty. Others may have carried secret grief, longing for a life they could never return to. And yet, through this sacrifice, they held the keys to the empire's most intimate secrets. The eunuchs remind us that power does not always belong to those with crowns or armies. Sometimes it belongs to those who stand in the shadows, holding the doors, carrying the whispers, deciding what is seen and what remains hidden. Without them, the Ottoman palace could not have functioned. With them, it became a world where silence was the greatest weapon of all. As you close your eyes tonight, picture those quiet figures moving through the palace. Their robes brush against the marble floors, their hands carry keys of iron and brass, and their eyes see everything yet reveal nothing. In their footsteps lies a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and hidden influence, a story that shaped the destiny of one of the greatest empires in history, yet remains written only in whispers. These were the watchers in the shadows, the eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire. Neither rulers nor ruled, they were something in between, a reminder that the greatest powers are often the ones that remain unseen. The harem was not just a gilded prison of women, it was also a political engine, a shadow court within the Sultan's palace that wielded influence equal to ministers and generals. It is easy to imagine the harem as a place of soft cushions, silken garments, and laughter echoing through tiled courtyards. But that was only a mask. Behind the beauty was a crucible of power, rivalry, and survival. The women who entered those gates were not merely companions. They were competitors, forced into a game that demanded cunning as much as charm. Every gesture, every word, every alliance mattered. The survival of a woman in the harem often depended on her ability to navigate this complex web, where kindness could be a disguise for plotting, and a smile could be a blade hidden behind silk. At the center of this world were the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and the favorites who won his attention. The Valide Sultan was perhaps the most powerful woman in the empire, guiding politics, manipulating appointments, and acting as the invisible hand behind her son's throne. Many sultans trusted their mothers above all else, and the palace ministers often found themselves bending to her influence. A single whisper from the Valid could elevate a servant to a governor or reduce a rival to dust. The irony of the harem was that women who had once been powerless, captured, bought, or taken from foreign lands, could become some of the most powerful figures in one of history's largest empires. And yet, power always came at a cost. The harem was structured like a hierarchy, a ladder carved into stone walls and guarded by silence. At the bottom were the newcomers, often young girls torn from their families and thrust into a world they could not yet understand. They were trained in manners, music, embroidery, poetry, and sometimes even politics, groomed not only to please, but also to serve. Above them were the concubines who had caught the Sultan's eye, each one striving to maintain his favor while watching others fall into obscurity. At the very top sat the favorites and the Valid Sultan, who orchestrated the delicate balance of rivalries, ensuring their chosen allies gained favor while enemies slipped into shadows. This was not merely about beauty, it was about intelligence, timing, and an unyielding will to survive. But survival in the harem was rarely peaceful. Poison was a tool as common as perfume. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Alliances between women could turn overnight, and what seemed like friendship could mask a calculated betrayal. A single rumor, true or false, could ruin a woman's standing, and sometimes her life. The eunuchs, who guarded and managed the harem, acted as both protectors and spies, feeding information to different factions, ensuring that no secret stayed buried for long. Their loyalty was often to the highest bidder or the one who could secure their rise in rank. In this way, the harem was not a secluded sanctuary. It was a battlefield, one fought with glances, secrets, and carefully placed words instead of swords. The most disturbing truth of all was that this silent war shaped the empire itself. The fate of ministers, generals, and provinces often depended on the influence of a woman within those guarded walls. A favorite could persuade the sultan to appoint her ally as a governor. A mother could ensure her son remained the heir despite rivals. Even wars were sometimes waged because of the harem's influence. Alliances with foreign powers could be nurtured or destroyed based on the background of a concubine or the ambitions of a valide sultan. To the world outside, the empire seemed ruled by a mighty sultan, but within the palace, it was often the whispers of women that guided his hand. And yet, for all the power, the harem remained a place of suffering. Many women never saw freedom again. The walls that glittered with tiles became cages, and the songs of birds in the gardens often felt like mockery of the lives they once knew. Even the most powerful could fall in a moment. The Valide Sultan, despite her influence, lived with constant fear that her time would pass, that a rival's son would ascend the throne, and her own bloodline would be erased. The harem was a place where love and cruelty intertwined, where beauty hid sorrow, and where the cost of survival was often one's humanity. Tonight, as we wander through these corridors in our minds, we step into a world where the soft rustle of silk could carry more danger than the clash of swords, and where every secret carved its mark on the destiny of the Ottoman Empire. The harem was also a world of paradoxes, of immense luxury and deep sorrow, of laughter echoing through candlelit chambers and muffled sobs hidden behind embroidered curtains. To outsiders, it appeared as a paradise of wealth and beauty, filled with women draped in silks, gold ornaments, and fragrances carried from distant lands. But step closer, and the illusion dissolved. The jewels were heavy, the perfumes concealed fear. The silk garments could not soften the weight of captivity. For many of these women, the harem was less a paradise than a prison, where the hours dragged endlessly, and the walls seemed to whisper reminders of the lives they had lost. One of the most unsettling truths about the harem was how young many of the women were when they entered. Some were barely teenagers, torn from their homes in wars, or bought through the trade routes that stitched together Asia, Africa, and Europe. A girl who had once played in her village streets might suddenly find herself thousands of miles away, trapped in a palace whose language she did not understand, her future bound to the whims of a ruler she had never seen. Some adapted, learning to weave poetry and strategy into their lives, but others faded, lost to despair, their names erased from memory. Their stories were rarely recorded, but their silences tell us as much as the legends of those who rose to power. The training of these girls was strict, almost ritualistic. They were taught the art of conversation, how to walk with grace, how to pour wine without spilling a drop, how to recite poetry with delicate pauses, and even how to hide their emotions behind carefully controlled expressions. But this education was not for their benefit. It was for the empires. The harem was designed to mold them into tools, whether as companions, political pawns, or bearers of heirs. It was a system that stripped away identity and rebuilt it under the shadow of the palace. And yet, some resisted quietly, holding on to their languages, their songs, their memories of home, even when everything around them demanded they forget. But resistance could be dangerous. The walls of the harem were filled with watchful eyes. Eunuchs, older women, rivals, and spies. Trust was a rare and fragile gift. A word spoken too openly could be carried to the wrong ears. A secret friendship could turn into a weapon. Imagine living in a world where even your laughter had to be measured, where every sigh might be misinterpreted, and where the wrong glance could spark suspicion. For the women of the harem, survival meant learning to play a game where the rules constantly shifted, and the stakes were nothing less than life itself. Yet, amid the cruelty, there were glimpses of humanity. Some women formed deep bonds of sisterhood, comforting one another in quiet corners, sharing stories of their childhoods, or teaching each other songs from faraway lands. These moments of tenderness were acts of defiance, proof that even in the empire's most controlled chamber, the human spirit could not be fully silenced. There were women who laughed together under the moonlight in the palace gardens, who found solace in painting, music, or prayer. These fragments of joy were small, but they mattered, for they reminded them that they were more than just pawns in a dangerous game. Still, the power of the harem could not be denied. The women who rose to prominence were not merely survivors. They were strategists, often shaping the fate of the empire as much as the Sultan himself. Some historians call this period the Sultanate of Women, when mothers, favorites, and wives influenced the course of politics, diplomacy, and war. Yet, with that power came isolation. Even the most powerful valued a sultan, commanding armies of servants and bending ministers to her will, lived within walls she could not escape. The higher one climbed, the greater the fall if fortune shifted. For in the harem, power was borrowed, never owned, and it could be taken away in a single night. And so, the harem remains one of history's greatest contradictions. It was both a cage and a throne, a place of suffering and of influence, where the destinies of empires were written in whispers rather than decrees. Tonight, as we reflect on its shadowed halls, we see not only the silks and jewels that dazzled the outside world, but also the heavy chains that bound the lives within. To understand the harem is to understand that behind every empire's glory lies a hidden cost, paid in silence, in sacrifice, and in secrets too deep to ever fade. The deeper you walk into the long and shadowed corridors of the Ottoman palaces, the more you realize that history isn't simply a collection of victories and ceremonies. it is also filled with whispers, hidden doors, and secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. Behind those grand marble arches and beneath the painted ceilings, countless lives played out in silence, many of them forgotten or deliberately erased. One of the most disturbing truths about the empire lies in the way power was maintained, guarded, and fought over. It wasn't just battles outside the walls that shaped the destiny of the Ottomans. It was also the silent wars fought inside the palace, where betrayal was more common than loyalty, and survival often meant doing the unthinkable. Inside Topkapi Palace, one of the empire's greatest symbols, there existed a labyrinth of rooms and chambers that outsiders were never allowed to enter. Servants who walked these halls often spoke in hushed voices, for they knew that the wrong word, even whispered, could mean their disappearance by morning. Eunuchs guarded every passage, not just with weapons, but with silence. They were both jailers and witnesses of the empire's darkest moments. Some historians describe how late at night, muffled footsteps and dragging sounds echoed through the stone hallways, shadows, moving bodies, silencing another rival prince, or quietly locking away a concubine who had fallen out of favor. Imagine living in a place where every corner might hide not just treasures, but screams no one was ever supposed to hear. One of the darkest traditions of the Ottoman court was the practice of fratricide, the killing of royal brothers. To prevent disputes over succession, sultans often ordered the deaths of their own siblings. It may sound unthinkable now, but to them it was considered necessary for stability. A newly crowned sultan would sometimes begin his reign by executing his brothers, no matter their age, to ensure that no rival bloodline could threaten his throne. In some cases, infants were strangled with silken cords, a method chosen because it shed no blood, preserving a grim sense of dignity even in death. Behind the palace curtains, where mothers wept in silence, the future of the empire was secured with hands that left no visible marks. These acts weren't celebrated, but they were accepted as the cruel price of empire. Every new ruler carried the weight of those sacrifices that were often their own kin. But cruelty wasn't always loud or sudden. Sometimes it was hidden in luxury itself. The imperial harem, often romanticized in stories and paintings, was far from the paradise people imagine. For many women brought into the harem, it was a gilded prison. Behind the jeweled curtains and soft music, there were strict rules, harsh rivalries, and silent punishments. Concubines competed not only for the sultan's favor, but also for survival, for influence, for the chance to secure a future for their children. A single misstep could mean exile within the palace walls or worse, disappearance into the shadows of history. The walls of the harem held countless untold stories of women who were promised dreams but lived their days in silent fear. Then there was the eerie practice of confining unwanted heirs. When fratricide was eventually abandoned, the Ottomans introduced a different system known as the cafes, or the cage. Here, princes who might one day challenge the throne were locked away in gilded apartments. They were not executed, but instead condemned to live in isolation, often for decades, cut off from the outside world. Many of these princes lost their sanity, pacing endlessly within their chambers, their youth slipping away behind barred windows. Imagine the torment of watching life pass by while knowing that your only crime was being born to the wrong mother at the wrong time. The palace was not just a place of gold and silk. It was also a place where dreams slowly withered in silence. And yet, for all this darkness, the empire continued to thrive, its grandeur dazzling the world. Ambassadors and visitors from Europe often wrote about the glittering processions, the magnificent feasts, and the disciplined armies. But what they did not see, or perhaps chose not to see, were the silent graves beneath their feet, the empty rooms where laughter once echoed before being silenced forever. The Ottomans mastered the art of appearing unshakable, presenting a face of glory to the world while keeping their shadows carefully hidden within. It is in those shadows, however, that the most human stories remain: the fear, the longing, the desperation, and the haunting truths that power can never truly hide. In the hushed chambers of Topkapi Palace, the air often carried more than the scent of incense and polished marble. It carried whispers, whispers of betrayal, whispers of alliances, whispers of fate being decided not by the clash of armies, but by the quiet scratch of a quill on parchment. Within the Ottoman Empire, history was not merely shaped on battlefields. It was molded in the stillness of council rooms, in secret meetings by candlelight, and in the guarded silences of men who understood that a single secret could shift the course of a dynasty. This is where the hidden machinery of power truly lay. The empire was vast, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the cold plains of Hungary, and managing such a realm required more than strength. It required information. The Ottomans were masters of gathering intelligence long before the word spy carried its modern meaning. Across the empire, networks of informants thrived. In bazaars, merchants pretended to haggle while passing coded messages. In caravanserais, travelers carried letters tucked inside false-bottomed chests. In mosques, sermons carried veiled warnings directed at those listening carefully. Every whisper mattered, because in the empire's delicate balance, silence could mean safety, but a spoken word could mean war. This constant undercurrent of espionage gave rise to a strange culture of suspicion. No one fully trusted anyone. Viziers questioned the loyalty of their own scribes. Soldiers eyed their commanders warily. Even brothers within the royal household doubted each other's intentions. It was not paranoia without reason. Ottoman history is filled with tales of plots revealed at the last moment, or coups rising from within the palace itself. A servant's overheard comment could unravel a conspiracy, while a single letter intercepted on the road could determine the fate of provinces. To live in the Ottoman Empire's higher ranks was to exist inside a labyrinth of secrets, each corridor darker than the last. But perhaps the most chilling reality was the palace practice known as the silence of the bowstring. Unlike the noisy executions of Europe, the Ottomans preferred silence when it came to removing threats from within. A bowstring tightened around the neck of a rival prince or a rebellious vizier left no blood to clean, no public spectacle to draw attention. It was swift, final, and often carried out in the dead of night. Imagine the psychological weight this carried. Each evening, courtiers dined in gold-lined halls, laughed under chandeliers, and traded witty remarks, knowing that by dawn one of them might be gone forever, erased not just from the room, but from the annals of history itself. For the ordinary people of the empire, these shadows were not always visible, but they were felt. When a provincial governor suddenly disappeared, rumors trickled into the streets. When caravans were stopped and searched without explanation, whispers spread in the coffee houses. Fear traveled faster than news. and the empire's subjects learned to live with uncertainty. It was a world where doors were kept half shut, conversations paused when strangers entered, and eyes often lingered on the ground, avoiding the wrong gaze. Yet within this atmosphere of tension, there was also a peculiar form of resilience. People found ways to carry on, to trade, to laugh, to marry, to pray. The empire's beauty, the domes rising against the skyline, the call to prayer echoing at dawn, the delicate artistry of tiles and carpets, continued to flourish even as secrets lurked in the corners. Life persisted because it had to. Perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of the Ottoman world, that even amidst fear, human beings cling to ordinary joys, to the small comforts that remind them of who they are. And so, as you picture the empire in its grandeur, remember too the quiet tension beneath it. The empires of the past were not built on strength alone. They were held together by silence, by secrets, and by the heavy weight of trust forever hanging in the balance. In that silence, countless stories remain untold. Stories of whispers that saved kingdoms, of betrayals that ended lives, and of ordinary men and women who learned to live in a world where truth was always just out of reach. As we close the pages of this story, think back to the empire we've walked through together. Behind the glittering domes, behind the marble halls and jeweled thrones, there was a world of shadows. A world where secrets carried more weight than swords, where a whisper could change the fate of a dynasty, and where silence was often more dangerous than noise. The Ottoman Empire was not only built on the strength of armies, but on the delicate threads of trust, suspicion, and hidden fear. It reminds us of something timeless. Power is never as solid as it appears. Empires may rise with grandeur, but they are always held together by fragile bonds, by the loyalty of a few, the silence of many, and the constant watchfulness of those in the dark. The Ottomans lived with this truth every day. Their palaces were magnificent, yes, but they were also prisons of suspicion. Their victories were glorious, but often written with the ink of betrayal. And yet, even in this world of shadows, life continued. Children played in courtyards, markets bustled with trade, and prayers rose into the skies above Istanbul, unbroken by fear. Perhaps that is why their story still fascinates us. It is not just about sultans and viziers, but about human nature itself. The struggle for survival, the hunger for power, and the small, fragile joys people cling to in uncertain times. These echoes remind us that history is not a distant tale. It is a mirror, quietly reflecting our own world. If you've enjoyed this journey through the hidden corners of the Ottoman Empire, I invite you to stay with us for more. Here, we uncover forgotten stories, explore the mysteries of the past, and share them in a calm, thoughtful way, perfect for winding down, reflecting, or simply drifting into rest. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Join us again as we continue to wander through the strange, haunting, and beautiful stories that history has left behind. Until next time, rest well and remember, the past is never truly silent.